There is a kind of silence that unsettles the flesh, a silence that makes the mind fidget and grasp for distraction, as if the absence of noise were a vacuum to be filled. Yet, to the soul trained in waiting, this silence is not emptiness at all, it is expectancy. It is the pregnant pause before the voice of God speaks, not the barren void we so often imagine. Our modern age fears silence because it reveals how noisy we've become within. But when everything external quiets down, we begin to hear what the heart has been whispering all along, and sometimes what God has been saying from the beginning. Silence is not the retreat of a coward, nor is it the escape of the disengaged. It is the arena of the soul where battles are fought and truths are revealed. When a person chooses silence before God, it is not because they have nothing to say, but because they finally recognize that they are not the most important voice in the room. It is a conscious laying down of opinion, argument, and inner chatter. In that sacred hush, we stop narrating our version of the story and begin listening for the authors. To the world, silence looks like inactivity. It appears to be a withdrawal. But in the life of one who walks with God, it is often the furnace of transformation. The seed that bears fruit lies buried in silent soil long before the harvest appears. The roots of spiritual maturity stretch down not in the clamor of public opinion or the spotlight of praise, but in the quiet obedience of the unseen heart. Those who cannot abide silence often reveal that they are uncomfortable with being unmasked by it. Because in silence, masks fall. We are stripped of pretense, forced to reckon with who we really are when no one else is watching. Expectancy, unlike assumption, does not demand or dictate. It waits, alert and open for what is to come. It is the posture of a child seated before a closed curtain, heart pounding with anticipation. It is the stance of the watchman who knows that dawn will come, even if the night stretches long. This is the silence of one who believes that God is not only listening, but also preparing to speak. Not with noise, but with meaning. Not with volume, but with weight. There is a paradox in holy silence. It both humbles and exalts. The one who embraces it begins to recognize how small they are and yet how deeply known. In silence, we feel both the insignificance of our place in the vastness of God's story and the tenderness of our significance in His heart. It is not a cold silence of abandonment, but a warm silence of invitation. God does not always thunder from the heavens. Sometimes He whispers from within. But that whisper cannot be heard when our minds are loud and our spirits frantic. In silence, we are taught the language of surrender. We learn to be content not knowing all the answers because we have begun to know the one who holds them. We discover that spiritual growth does not always come from new information, but from deeper revelation that comes not by force, but by stillness. Just as the earth must lie fallow before it can be fertile again, the soul must lie quiet before it can be filled anew. The most powerful encounters with God are rarely accompanied by spectacle. They often take place in the stillness of dawn, the hush of the wilderness, or the loneliness of a waiting room. These moments are not flashy, but they are sacred. In them, something eternal presses gently into time, and if we are not distracted, we feel it. We may not hear words, but we are spoken to. We may not see visions, but our sight is cleared. To be silent before God is to admit that He is worth hearing above all else. It is to set down the compulsive need to speak, explain, justify, and control. It is to say, without saying, "You are God and I am not." And in that humility, the silence becomes a sanctuary. It becomes a space where faith is not only professed but practiced, where trust is not only declared but demonstrated. Silence, when joined with expectancy, becomes worship. It is no longer just the absence of noise, it is the presence of reverence. It is what the angels keep in awe, what the saints cultivate in solitude, what the wise pursue when the world rushes by. It is the unseen well where wisdom gathers, the hidden altar where devotion burns quietly but steadily. And it is there, in that still and expectant place, that God often chooses to meet us, not in the chaos of performance, but in the calm of presence. There is a subtle, An often mistaken notion that humility consists in self-belittlement, in constantly reminding oneself of one's shortcomings, sins, or insignificance. But such a view is still curiously self-centered. It merely shifts the spotlight from self-praise to self-criticism, yet the focus remains the same, the self. True humility, the kind that reshapes a life and makes space for God to dwell richly within, is not about thinking less of oneself. It is about forgetting oneself entirely. It is not the insecure muttering of unworthiness, but the freedom from the need to measure worth at all. Humility is not self-hatred masquerading as virtue. It is not found in downcast eyes or false modesty, nor in the social rituals of pretending to deny compliments. These may be signs of cultural etiquette or wounded pride, but they do not reach the deep root of what it means to be humble. Real humility is liberation, the release from the endless calculation of how one is perceived, how one compares, how one performs. It is a turning away from the mirror, not to despise the image, but to become so enraptured by something greater that the mirror is forgotten altogether. To forget oneself is not to become passive or weak. On the contrary, those who are most humble are often the most daring and resolved. They act without hesitation, not because they are brash, but because they are not consumed with how their actions reflect on their ego. Their courage is not the bluster of pride, but the steadiness of a soul anchored in something or someone greater than self-interest. The humble heart serves not to be seen, but because it no longer needs to be seen. This kind of humility is forged not in isolation, but in the presence of the divine. It is what happens when one stands before the greatness of God and realizes that self-absorption is not only unhelpful, it is absurd. It is the natural result of beholding infinite beauty and recognizing that no amount of self-glorification can make a person shine brighter than a sun they did not ignite. The humble do not struggle to be impressive because they have already been impressed, overwhelmed, even by the majesty of their Maker. Such forgetfulness of self allows for a new kind of vision. No longer obsessed with our own image, we are free to see others more clearly. Pride distorts perception. It turns every conversation into a performance, every act into a transaction. But humility clears the lens. It enables empathy. It lets us delight in others' victories without envy, to mourn their losses without superiority, and to walk alongside them not as rivals or spectators, but as fellow travelers. This does not mean the humble deny their gifts. It means they know where those gifts come from. The artist paints, the teacher teaches, the leader leads not for applause, but out of obedience and joy. There is no need to overinflate or understate the talent, because it is not theirs to possess, it is theirs to steward. The humble are content to play their part in the symphony without insisting on a solo, because they know the music is more beautiful than any single instrument. To forget oneself entirely is also to be free from the exhausting need to curate every interaction, every word, every appearance. It is the end of spiritual performance, no longer burdened by the question, how do I look to others? The humble soul asks a better one, how can I love more deeply, serve more faithfully, live more truly? In doing so, their energy is not sapped by comparison or anxiety, but directed toward purpose. This kind of humility is offensive to the world because it cannot be commodified. It doesn't compete in the marketplace of ego or shout for validation. It does not appeal to pride because it is the antidote to it. The world praises self-expression, but humility chooses self-forgetfulness. The world promotes branding the self, but humility seeks to bear the image of another. Humility, then, is not timidity. It is bold in its surrender. It is not weakness, but strength cloaked in meekness. It does not announce itself, but it shapes everything around it. The humble may go unnoticed, but their presence leaves deep imprints on hearts, on communities, on eternity. They do not seek recognition, but they are known by heaven. And so to practice humility is not to deny what we are, but to stop making ourselves the center of all things. It is to be so absorbed in the goodness, glory, and will of God that we forget to obsess over our own reflections. In that forgetting, paradoxically, we become most fully who we were meant to be, not diminished, but rightly placed, not erased, but reordered, not suppressed, but sanctified. To focus on God is not to abandon one's responsibilities or retreat from the world. It is not an invitation to neglect the tasks entrusted to our care, family, work, service, study, but rather a call to perform them from a place of deeper alignment and sacred intention. The mistaken belief that one must withdraw from all earthly obligation to commune with the divine is not rooted in truth, but in a misunderstanding of how spiritual focus functions. It is not duty that must die, it is distraction. What clouds the heart is not the labor of our hands, but the dividedness of our minds. The modern soul is not starved for activity, it is drowning in it. But the peril is not in the abundance of things to do, it is in the disorder of affections. We live in a time when one's calendar can be full and the soul completely empty, where endless engagement with noise leaves little room for stillness of spirit. The heart that tries to do everything for everyone ends up doing nothing for the one. And so the call is not to forsake duty, but to return to order, to kill distraction so that duty can be sanctified. Distraction is not merely the presence of external noise, it is the absence of internal clarity. One can be physically still and yet spiritually scattered. Likewise, a person can be working with intensity and yet be entirely centered on God. The difference lies in where the gaze of the heart is fixed. When we focus on God, we are not less present in our responsibilities, we are more deeply embedded in their eternal significance. The mother who changes diapers, the student who wrestles with ideas, the worker who faithfully completes a task when done in love and attention to God, these are no less holy than the prayers whispered in the dark. To kill distraction requires intention. It requires the recognition that not everything demanding our attention deserves it. There is a great temptation to confuse urgency with importance, noise with significance, motion with progress. But many of the things that fill our time do not fill our spirit. They simply keep us moving so we do not have to face the silence where God waits. Distraction often becomes a spiritual drug, a constant stimulus that numbs the ache for deeper communion. This is not a call to live in monasteries or to reject modern tools, but to master them. The phone, the screen, the notification, the next obligation, these are not inherently evil. But when they are permitted to reign, they steal the soul's attention away from its truest desire. The heart was not made to flit from thing to thing, but to rest in the presence of its Maker, and from that resting place to engage the world with purpose. Duty, then, becomes a sacred offering when it flows from devotion. It is not cast aside, but transformed. The teacher teaches not just to inform, but to embody truth. The parent parents not only to nurture, but to reflect the Father's love. The servant serves not for recognition, but out of reverence. When God is the center, duty is no longer drudgery, it is worship in disguise. What once felt mundane becomes miraculous when seen through the lens of the eternal. Focusing on God requires more than just turning off external noise. It demands the ordering of the inner life. Thoughts must be tamed, not ignored. Desires must be examined, not suppressed. The will must be trained, not avoided. This inner discipline is not glamorous, and it often goes unseen. But it is the slow and steady path toward clarity. As distractions fall away, what remains is not emptiness, it is space for presence, for awareness, for God. There will always be duties to fulfill. This is the nature of life. But the person who has died to distraction performs those duties with an anchored heart. They are not tossed by every interruption nor controlled by every craving. Their yes is deliberate, their no is discerning. They are no longer slaves to the urgent, but servants of the eternal. Their work becomes prayer, their choices become offerings, and their presence becomes peace to those around them. The great challenge, then, is not how to remove ourselves from the world, but how to remain in it while remaining fixed on something higher. To focus on God is to live with dual awareness, to see the surface of things and the depths beneath them, to act in time while abiding in eternity. It is to fold the sacred into the ordinary until the two are indistinguishable. So the aim is not withdrawal from duty, but purification of focus. The goal is not inactivity, but undivided attention. The world does not need more who escape their roles. It needs more who inhabit them with reverence. God does not call us to abandon the field. He calls us to fight in it with eyes locked on Him. In doing so, we find that focusing on God is not a retreat from life, but the only way to live it rightly. There is a softness to the voice of heaven that pride simply cannot perceive. Divine truth does not shout over the noise of self-importance. It waits in stillness, veiled in quietness, clothed in humility. The proud heart, inflated by its own certainty, expects God to speak in ways that affirm its position, its intelligence, its superiority. But heaven does not flatter. It calls to the lowly, the contrite, the one who has come to the end of their own sufficiency. It does not compete for attention. It invites surrender. Pride is a kind of deafness. It fills the ears with the sound of one's own name. It speaks loudly of what it already knows, drowning out any possibility of receiving something new. The proud cannot hear heaven's whisper because they are always speaking, if not outwardly, then inwardly, always narrating, justifying, comparing. Pride is always on stage. It has no audience but itself. And when heaven speaks, it refuses to compete with such a show. It speaks beneath it, below it, in the subterranean spaces where only the humble go. Heaven's voice is not always dramatic. It rarely arrives with thunder. It prefers the rustle of leaves in a still morning, the soft echo of conviction in a silent heart, the subtle shift of a soul realizing it has been seen by a love that does not need to impress. Pride waits for grandeur and is offended by gentleness. It demands that God prove Himself through spectacle. But God reveals Himself through subtleties that the proud have neither patience for nor interest in. The proud want to lead even in the things of God. They want to be the ones who discover truth, who interpret mysteries, who stand above others with insight and revelation. But the kingdom of heaven is not built on brilliance, it is built on brokenness. God chooses the weak things of the world, not because He is limited in His options, but because only the weak are quiet enough to hear Him. Only the broken pause long enough to listen without agenda. Only the small have room in their hearts for something as vast as the voice of heaven. Pride is convinced it already knows what heaven would say. It assumes alignment between its own opinions and divine will. It prays, not to listen but to be validated. It studies not to learn but to confirm what it already believes. It stands tall, but in standing tall, it grows too high to stoop down where truth is hidden. Because heaven's treasures are buried in humility, not elevated in acclaim. The whisper of God often comes in the middle of interruption. Not in the presentation, but in the pause. Not in the declaration, but in the question that lingers after the words have run dry. The proud do not linger, they rush on, uncomfortable with what they cannot dominate. But the humble remain. They do not need to be right, they only want to be real. They are not seeking to impress, they are seeking to be transformed. To hear heaven is to be quiet on the inside. It is to silence the internal dialogue that insists on being significant, applauded, admired. It is to stop demanding answers and instead receive presence. Pride is quick to speak, quick to defend, quick to assume. Humility listens, waits, wonders, and in that listening it begins to perceive things that pride can never understand. Heaven whispers through weakness, through grief, through disappointment. It speaks in the long nights where there are no answers, only aching. It reveals itself in the kindness that expects no repayment, the patience that endures without recognition. The proud cannot see God in these things because they do not value them. They only look for God where there is victory, clarity, and reward. But the humble know better. They know that heaven often hides itself in what the world calls loss. Even in Scripture, God does not speak to those who stand with pompous certainty. He comes to shepherds in the field, not rulers in the palace. He draws near to tax collectors, not the self-righteous scholars. He speaks through children, not officials. The proud miss the Messiah because they are too occupied looking for a king who fits their mold. The humble follow a carpenter with dusty feet and wounded hands because they've learned to hear the voice behind the simplicity. Pride expects God to affirm the self. Humility allows God to undo it. And in that undoing, heaven is heard not as a crashing announcement, but as a whisper that cuts more deeply than a sword. It does not flatter. It purifies. It does not shout for attention. It waits for surrender. And in the quiet place where ego is laid to rest, the voice of heaven becomes unmistakable, not because it has grown louder, but because the soul has finally grown quiet enough to hear it. There is a kind of strength that the world applauds loud, forceful, attention-grabbing. It arrives with volume, with dominance, with spectacle, but spiritual strength belongs to an entirely different category. It is quiet, often invisible to the crowd, and it draws its power not from exertion, but from surrender. True strength, the kind that endures storms, bears burdens, resists temptation, and lives with integrity, does not roar. It reveres, it bows before the source of all power, not in fear, but in holy awe. The world teaches us to associate strength with assertion, speak loudly, take space, be bold, be heard. But spiritual resilience is not measured by the size of one's voice, but by the stillness of one's soul. It is not found in conquering others, but in conquering the self. And this victory begins with reverence, with a heart that is rightly aligned under the majesty of God. To revere is to recognize that you are not the center, that there is something greater, someone holy, before whom you must remove your shoes. Roaring demands attention. Reverence gives it. Roaring announces self. Reverence forgets self. Roaring reacts. Reverence listens. The one who reveres God is not weaker for it. They are stronger than the loudest lion because their strength does not depend on them. It flows from an eternal source. The one who kneels before the throne of heaven can stand before any storm on earth. They are not moved because they are not alone. There is a stillness to true strength. It does not panic when tested. It does not shout to prove itself. It does not manipulate to maintain power. It simply abides, like a mountain unmoved by the wind or a tree rooted deep beneath the surface. Spiritual strength holds its ground, not because it is showy, but because it is grounded. And grounding comes from reverence, an inner posture of continual awareness of God's supremacy, holiness, and nearness. Reverence is the soil in which spiritual discipline grows. It is the foundation of obedience, not out of obligation, but out of love. It is what keeps the soul tender before God and firm before men. It teaches restraint not because one is powerless to act, but because one is surrendered to a higher will. It allows for gentleness because the need to dominate has been crucified. It allows for silence because truth is not always proven by volume. To revere is to live with attention to what is sacred, what is eternal, what is unseen. The person who lives with reverence does not treat life lightly. They are careful with their words, not out of fear, but out of honor. They are faithful in the small things, knowing nothing is hidden from the eyes of God. They serve without seeking credit. They give without demanding praise. Their strength is not theatrical, it is consistent. Roaring may win the room, but reverence wins the soul. The one who lives to impress others will always be performing. But the one who lives before the face of God finds freedom from the exhausting need to be admired. They are content to be invisible to the world because they know they are seen by the one who matters most. And in being seen, they are strengthened not with the strength that fades when applause dies down, but with the strength that endures when no one is watching. There is a power in reverent living that cannot be replicated by charisma or confidence. It is the quiet authority of someone who walks with God. It is the peace of someone whose conscience is clear. It is the fire of someone who fears nothing because they fear God. The spiritually strong do not clench their fists, they open their hands. They do not storm rooms, they bow in prayer. They do not boast in their capacity, they boast in their dependence. Scripture does not commend the proud, the boastful, or the self-sufficient. It elevates the meek, the humble, the God-fearing. Moses, who led millions, was called the meekest man on earth. Jesus, whose name is above all names, washed feet in silence. These are not contradictions, they are revelations. They show us that reverence is not weakness, it is power made holy. It is strength that kneels, and in kneeling rises with grace that cannot be manufactured by human effort. Spiritual strength is not found in moments of noise, but in lives of consecration. It is built in the hidden places, the quiet prayers, the decisions made in secret. It is not explosive, it is enduring. It does not sparkle, it shines steadily. And it is formed not by asserting control, but by surrendering to the one who holds all things together. The world will always admire the raw, but heaven watches for the reverent. The ones whose hearts tremble before God will walk with unshakable calm through chaos. The ones who bow low will be lifted up not because they climbed, but because they trusted. Reverence doesn't shout, it stands in awe. And from that awe comes a strength no noise can replicate. We live in a world addicted to noise, constant motion, unceasing updates, relentless declarations. Our culture equates visibility with value, volume with truth, and performance with worth. In such a world, it is easy to carry this mindset into our spiritual lives, to assume that the more we speak, the louder we pray, the more religious words we use, the more God will take notice. But the God who formed the human heart does not need to be impressed by its noise. He is not moved by spectacle or stirred by our self-importance. He is drawn instead to our need. It is not eloquence that touches heaven, but dependence. God listens not to the ones who perform best, but to the ones who know they cannot perform at all. He hears not the thunder of pretension, but the whisper of surrender. Our loud declarations, carefully cations, and spiritual facades may impress people, but they do not impress God, for He sees through all of it. He knows what lies behind the noise, and He does not recoil from our need, He runs toward it. In the stillness of desperation, there is a kind of clarity. When pretense is stripped away, when the masks fall off, and when the soul finally admits its poverty, that is where divine grace breaks through. God is not attracted to our strength, but to our weakness. He is not swayed by how confidently we speak, but how humbly we admit our emptiness. In a world that celebrates noise as power, God celebrates need as the path to encounter. The prophets of old did not thunder from a place of ego, they wept from a place of burden. Jesus did not praise the Pharisee who stood with eloquence and pride, but the tax collector who beat his chest and whispered, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." Heaven's attention is not caught by those who strive to look holy, but by those who know they are unworthy and come anyway. It is not performance that pleases God, but poverty of spirit. There is a sacred beauty in being needy before God. Not the kind of neediness rooted in entitlement, but the kind that flows from humility. The kind that knows no one else can heal, no one else can satisfy, no one else can restore. This kind of need doesn't speak loudly, it groans inwardly. It doesn't always know what to pray, it just knows who to turn to. And that is enough. God draws near to such hearts. Noise can be a hiding place, a wall we build to keep ourselves from facing what truly aches within us. We talk over the silence, afraid of what it might reveal. We fill our time, our feeds, our minds, our mouths, but God does not dwell in the chaos of self-imposed distraction. He waits in the quiet where the soul lays bare its true condition, and there He does not chastise or condemn. He draws close like a physician bending low over a wound, not repulsed by the damage but eager to heal. The incarnation itself is the clearest expression of this divine pattern. God did not come to earth in a chariot of fire with blaring trumpets and a display of overwhelming might. He came in the womb of a virgin, in a stable, in the cries of an infant. Heaven met earth in the softest of ways, proving that God is not interested in overpowering us with noise, but in coming close to our weakness. Christ's life was marked by moments of profound silence, solitude in the wilderness, prayer in the night, stillness before the cross. These were not empty silences, they were filled with surrender. When we bring our noise to God, thinking it will earn us favor, we miss the very heart of grace. God is not a deity to be entertained. He is a father to be trusted. And fathers are not moved by performance, they are moved by their children's cry. Our most honest prayers are often our least articulate ones. The sigh, the tear, the broken sentence, the ache that cannot form words, these are received in heaven with more reverence than the most polished speech. So we must unlearn the lie that says we must come to God cleaned up, loud, and certain. He is not waiting for us to impress him. He is waiting for us to need him. And this need is not a sign of spiritual immaturity. It is the very doorway into maturity. For it is only when we acknowledge our dependence that we truly begin to grow. God is drawn to the lowly, to the crushed in spirit, to the hungry and thirsty, to those who come with empty hands and hopeful hearts. He resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And that grace flows not toward those who shout for attention, but to those who wait in quiet surrender. God's ears are not tuned to volume, but to vulnerability. His presence is not earned through noise, but invited through need. In a world still addicted to sound and spectacle, the invitation remains, come quietly, come honestly, come in need. And there, in the sacred silence of surrender, you will find that heaven is not distant. It has been waiting for you to stop performing and start depending.